The most memorable example of what has been advanced is afforded by a great pestilence of the 14th century, which desolated Asia, Europe, and Africa, and of which the people yet preserve the remembrance in gloomy traditions. It was an oriental plague marked by inflammatory boils and tumors of the glands, such as break out in no other febrile disease. On account of these inflammatory boils, and from the black spots indicatory of a putrid decomposition which appeared upon the skin, it was called in Germany and in the northern kingdoms of Europe the Black Death, and in Italy la mortalega grande, the great mortality. Few testimonies are presented to us respecting its symptoms and its course, yet these are sufficient to throw light upon the form of the malady, and they are worthy of credence, from their coincidence with the signs of the same disease in modern times. The imperial writer Cantacusenus, whose own son Andronicus died of this plague in Constantinople, notices great imposthumes of the thighs and arms of those affected, which, when opened, afforded relief by the discharge of an offensive matter. Buboes, which are the infallible signs of the oriental plague, are thus plainly indicated, for he makes separate mention of smaller boils on the arms and in the face, as also in other parts of the body, and clearly distinguishes these from the blisters which are no less produced by plague in all its forms. In many cases, black spots broke out all over the body, either single or united and confluent. These symptoms were not all found in every case. In many, one alone was sufficient to cause death, while some patients recovered contrary to expectation, though afflicted with all. Symptoms of cephalic affection were frequent. Many patients became stupefied and fell into a deep sleep, losing also their speech from palsy of the tongue. Others remained sleepless and without rest. The fauces and tongue were black, and as if suffused with blood. No beverage would assuage their burning thirst, so that their sufferings continued without alleviation until terminated by death, which many in their despair accelerated with their own hands. Contagion was evident, for attendants caught the disease of their relations and friends, and many houses in the capital were bereft even of their last inhabitant. Thus far the ordinary circumstances only of the oriental plague occurred. Still deeper sufferings, however, were connected with this pestilence, such as have not been felt at other times. The organs of respiration were seized with a putrid inflammation. A violent pain in the chest attacked the patient. Blood was expectorated, and the breath diffused a pestiferous odor. In the West, the following were the predominating symptoms on the eruption of this disease. An ardent fever, accompanied by an evacuation of blood, proved fatal in the first 3 days. It appears that buboes and inflammatory boils did not at first come out at all, but that the disease, in the form of carbuncular, anthracsartigen, affection of the lungs, effected the destruction of life before the other symptoms were developed. Thus did the plague rage in Avignon for 6 or 8 weeks, and the pestilential breath of the sick, who expectorated blood, caused a terrible contagion far and near. For even the vicinity of those who had fallen ill of plague was certain death, so that parents abandoned their infected children, and all the ties of kindred were dissolved. After this period, buboes in the axilla and in the groin, and inflammatory boils all over the body made their appearance. But it was not until 7 months afterwards that some patients recovered with matured buboes, as in the ordinary milder form of the plague. Such is the report of the courageous Guy de Chauliac, who vindicated the honor of medicine by bidding defiance to danger, boldly and constantly assisting the affected, and disdaining the excuse of his colleagues, who held the Arabian notion that medical aid was unavailing and that contagion justified flight. He saw the plague twice in Avignon, first in the year 1348, from January to August, and then 12 years later, in the autumn, when it returned from Germany, and for 9 months spread general distress and terror. The first time it raged chiefly among the poor, but in the year 1360 more among the higher classes. It now also destroyed a great many children, whom it had formerly spared, but few women. The like was seen in Egypt. Here also inflammation of the lungs was predominant, and destroyed quickly and infallibly, with burning heat and expectoration of blood. Here too the breath of the sick spread a deadly contagion, and human aid was as vain as it was destructive to those who approached the infected. Boccaccio, who was an eyewitness of its incredible fatality in Florence, the seat of the revival of science, gives a more lively description of the attack of the disease than his non-medical contemporaries. It commenced here, not as in the East, with bleeding at the nose, a sure sign of inevitable death, but there took place at the beginning, both in men and women, tumors in the groin and in the axilla, varying in circumference up to the size of an apple or an egg, and called by the people pest boils, gavoccioli. Then there appeared similar tumors indiscriminately over all parts of the body, and black or blue spots came out on the arms or thighs, or on other parts, either single and large, or small and thickly studded. These spots proved equally fatal with the pest boils, which had been from the first regarded as a sure sign of death. No power of medicine brought relief. Almost all died within the first 3 days, some sooner, some later, after the appearance of these signs, and for the most part entirely without fever or other symptoms. The plague spread itself with the greater fury as it communicated from the sick to the healthy, like fire among dry and oily fuel, and even contact with the clothes and other articles which had been used by the infected seemed to induce the disease. As it advanced, not only men but animals fell sick and shortly expired if they had touched things belonging to the diseased or dead. Thus Boccaccio himself saw 2 hogs on the rags of a person who had died of plague, after staggering about for a short time, fall down dead as if they had taken poison. In other places, multitudes of dogs, cats, fowls, and other animals fell victims to the contagion, and it is to be presumed that other epizoots among animals likewise took place, although the ignorant writers of the 14th century are silent on this point. In Germany there was a repetition in every respect of the same phenomena. The infallible signs of the oriental bubo plague, with its inevitable contagion, were found there as everywhere else, but the mortality was not nearly so great as in the other parts of Europe. The accounts do not all make mention of the spitting of blood, the diagnostic symptom of this fatal pestilence. We are not, however, thence to conclude that there was any considerable mitigation or modification of the disease, for we must not only take into account the defectiveness of the chronicles, but that isolated testimonies are often contradicted by many others. Thus the chronicles of Strasbourg, which only take notice of boils and glandular swellings in the axillae and groins, are opposed by another account, according to which the mortal spitting of blood was met with in Germany. But this again is rendered suspicious, as the narrator postpones the death of those who were thus affected to the 6th and even the 8th day, whereas no other author sanctions so long a course of the disease. And even in Strasbourg, where a mitigation of the plague may with most probability be assumed, since in the year 1349 only 16,000 people were carried off, the generality expired by the 3rd or 4th day. In Austria, and especially in Vienna, the plague was fully as malignant as anywhere, so that the patients who had red spots and black boils, as well as those afflicted with tumid glands, died about the 3rd day. And lastly, very frequent sudden deaths occurred on the coast of the North Sea and in Westphalia, without any further development of the malady. To France, this plague came in a northern direction from Avignon, and was there more destructive than in Germany, so that in many places not more than 2 in 20 of the inhabitants survived. Many were struck as if by lightning, and died on the spot, and this more frequently among the young and strong than the old. Patients with enlarged glands in the axillae and groins scarcely survived 2 or 3 days, and no sooner did these fatal signs appear than they bid adieu to the world, and sought consolation only in the absolution which Pope Clement VI promised them in the hour of death. In England the malady appeared, as at Avignon, with spitting of blood, and with the same fatality, so that the sick who were afflicted either with this symptom or with vomiting of blood died in some cases immediately, in others within 12 hours, or at the latest in 2 days. The inflammatory boils and buboes in the groins and axillae were recognized at once as prognosticating a fatal issue, and those were past all hope of recovery in whom they arose in numbers all over the body. It was not till towards the close of the plague that they ventured to open by incision these hard and dry boils, when matter flowed from them in small quantity, and thus, by compelling nature to a critical suppuration, many patients were saved. Every spot which the sick had touched, their breath, their clothes, spread the contagion, and, as in all other places, the attendants and friends, who were either blind to their danger or heroically despised it, fell a sacrifice to their sympathy. Even the eyes of the patient were considered as sources of contagion which had the power of acting at a distance, whether on account of their unwonted luster, or the distortion which they always suffer in plague, or whether in conformity with an ancient notion, according to which the sight was considered as the bearer of a demoniacal enchantment. Flight from the infected cities seldom availed the fearful, for the germ of the disease adhered to them, and they fell sick, remote from assistance, in the solitude of their country houses. Thus did the plague spread over England with unexampled rapidity, after it had first broken out in the county of Dorset, whence it advanced through the counties of Devon and Somerset to Bristol, and thence reached Gloucester, Oxford, and London. Probably few places escaped, perhaps not any, for the annals of contemporaries report that throughout the land only a 10th part of the inhabitants remained alive. From England the contagion was carried by a ship to Bergen, the capital of Norway, where the plague then broke out in its most frightful form with vomiting of blood, and throughout the whole country spared not more than a third of the inhabitants. The sailors found no refuge in their ships, and vessels were often seen driving about on the ocean and drifting on shore, whose crews had perished to the last man. In Poland, the infected were attacked with spitting of blood, and died in a few days in such vast numbers that, as it has been affirmed, scarcely a fourth of the inhabitants were left. Finally, in Russia, the plague appeared 2 years later than in southern Europe, yet here again with the same symptoms as elsewhere. Russian contemporaries have recorded that it began with rigor, heat, and darting pain in the shoulders and back, that it was accompanied by spitting of blood, and terminated fatally in 2 or at most 3 days. It is not till the year 1360 that we find buboes mentioned as occurring in the neck, in the axillae, and in the groins, which are stated to have broken out when the spitting of blood had continued some time. According to the experience of Western Europe, however, it cannot be assumed that these symptoms did not appear at an earlier period. Thus much from authentic sources on the nature of the Black Death. The descriptions which have been communicated contain, with a few unimportant exceptions, all the symptoms of the Oriental plague which have been observed in more modern times. No doubt can obtain on this point. The facts are placed clearly before our eyes. We must, however, bear in mind that this violent disease does not always appear in the same form, and that while the essence of the poison which it produces and which is separated so abundantly from the body of the patient remains unchanged, it is proteiform in its varieties, from the almost imperceptible vesicle unaccompanied by fever, which exists for some time before it extends its poison inwardly and then excites fever and buboes, to the fatal form in which carbuncular inflammations fall upon the most important viscera. Such was the form which the plague assumed in the 14th century. For the accompanying chest affection, which appeared in all the countries whereof we have received any account, cannot, on a comparison with similar and familiar symptoms, be considered as any other than the inflammation of the lungs of modern medicine, a disease which at present only appears sporadically, and owing to a putrid decomposition of the fluids, is probably combined with hemorrhages from the vessels of the lungs. Now, as every carbuncle, whether it be cutaneous or internal, generates in abundance the matter of contagion which has given rise to it, so therefore must the breath of the affected have been poisonous in this plague, and on this account its power of contagion wonderfully increased. Wherefore the opinion appears incontrovertible that owing to the accumulated numbers of the diseased, not only individual chambers and houses, but whole cities were infected, which moreover in the Middle Ages were with few exceptions narrowly built, kept in a filthy state, and surrounded with stagnant ditches. Flight was in consequence of no avail to the timid, for even though they had sedulously avoided all communication with the diseased and the suspected, yet their clothes were saturated with the pestiferous atmosphere, and every inspiration imparted to them the seeds of the destructive malady, which in the greater number of cases germinated with but too much fertility. Add to which the usual propagation of the plague through clothes, beds, and 1,000 other things to which the pestilential poison adheres, a propagation which from want of caution must have been infinitely multiplied. And since articles of this kind, removed from the excess of air, not only retain the matter of contagion for an indefinite period, but also increase its activity and engender it like a living being, frightful ill consequences followed for many years after the first fury of the pestilence was past. The affection of the stomach, often mentioned in vague terms and occasionally as a vomiting of blood, was doubtless only a subordinate symptom, even if it be admitted that actual hematemesis did occur. For the difficulty of distinguishing a flow of blood from the stomach from a pulmonic expectoration of that fluid is, to non-medical men, even in common cases, not inconsiderable. How much greater, then, must it have been in so terrible a disease, where assistants could not venture to approach the sick without exposing themselves to certain death? Only two medical descriptions of the malady have reached us. The one by the brave Guy de Chauliac, the other by Raymond Chalin de Vinarieux, a very experienced scholar who was well versed in the learning of his time. The former takes notice only of fatal coughing of blood. The latter, besides this, notices epistaxis, hematuria, and fluxes of blood from the bowels, as symptoms of such decided and speedy mortality that those patients in whom they were observed usually died on the same or the following day. That a vomiting of blood may not here and there have taken place, perhaps have been even prevalent in many places, is from a consideration of the nature of the disease by no means to be denied. For every putrid decomposition of the fluids begets a tendency to hemorrhages of all kinds. Here, however, it is a question of historical certainty, which after these doubts is by no means established. Had not so speedy a death followed the expectoration of blood, we should certainly have received more detailed intelligence respecting other hemorrhages. But the malady had no time to extend its effects further over the extremities of the vessels. After its first fury, however, was spent, the pestilence passed into the usual febrile form of the oriental plague. Internal carbuncular inflammations no longer took place, and hemorrhages became phenomena no more essential in this than they are in any other febrile disorders. Chalin, who observed not only the great mortality of 1348 and the plague of 1360, but also that of 1373 and 1382, speaks moreover of affections of the throat, and describes the black spots of plague patients more satisfactorily than any of his contemporaries. The former appeared but in a few cases, and consisted in carbuncular inflammation of the gullet, with the difficulty of swallowing, even to suffocation, to which in some instances was added inflammation of the ceruminous glands of the ears, with tumors producing great deformity. Such patients, as well as others, were affected with expectoration of blood. But they did not usually die before the 6th, and sometimes even so late as the 14th day. The same occurrence, it is well known, is not uncommon in other pestilences, as also blisters on the surface of the body in different places, in the vicinity of which tumid glands and inflammatory boils surrounded by discolored and black streaks arose, and thus indicated the reception of the poison. These streaked spots were called, by an apt comparison, the girdle, and this appearance was justly considered extremely dangerous. An inquiry into the causes of the Black Death will not be without important results in the study of the plagues which have visited the world, although it cannot advance beyond generalization without entering upon a field hitherto uncultivated and to this hour entirely unknown. Mighty revolutions in the organism of the earth, of which we have credible information, had preceded it. From China to the Atlantic, the foundations of the earth were shaken. Throughout Asia and Europe, the atmosphere was in commotion, and endangered by its baneful influence both vegetable and animal life. The series of these great events began in the year 1333. 15 years before the plague broke out in Europe, they first appeared in China. Here a parching drought, accompanied by famine, commenced in the tract of country watered by the rivers Kiang and Huai. This was followed by such violent torrents of rain in and about Kingsai, at that time the capital of the empire, that, according to tradition, more than 400,000 people perished in the floods. Finally, the mountain Chinchou fell in, and vast clefts were formed in the earth. In the succeeding year, 1334, passing over fabulous traditions, the neighborhood of Canton was visited by inundations, whilst in Che, after an unexampled drought, a plague arose which is said to have carried off about 5 million of people. A few months afterwards an earthquake followed at and near Kingsai, and subsequent to the falling in of the mountains of Kiming-chan, a lake was formed of more than 100 leagues in circumference, where again thousands found their grave. In Ho-Kwang and Ho-Nan, a drought prevailed for 5 months, and innumerable swarms of locusts destroyed the vegetation, while famine and pestilence, as usual, followed in their train. Connected accounts of the condition of Europe before this great catastrophe are not to be expected from the writers of the 14th century. It is remarkable, however, that simultaneously with the drought and renewed floods in China, in 1336, many uncommon atmospheric phenomena, and in the winter frequent thunderstorms, were observed in the north of France, and so early as the eventful year of 1333, an eruption of Etna took place. According to the Chinese annals, about 4 million of people perished by famine in the neighborhood of Kiang in 1337, and deluges, swarms of locusts, and an earthquake which lasted 6 days caused incredible devastation. In the same year, the first swarms of locusts appeared in Franconia, which were succeeded in the following year by myriads of these insects. In 1338, Kingsay was visited by an earthquake of 10 days' duration. At the same time, France suffered from a failure in the harvest, and thenceforth till the year 1342 there was in China a constant succession of inundations, earthquakes, and famines. In the same year, great floods occurred in the vicinity of the Rhine and in France, which could not be attributed to rain alone, for everywhere, even on the tops of mountains, springs were seen to burst forth, and dry tracts were laid under water in an inexplicable manner. In the following year, the mountain of Hongchang in China fell in, and caused a destructive deluge, and in Pianzhou and Liangzhou, after 3 months' rain, there followed unheard-of inundations, which destroyed 7 cities. In Egypt and Syria, violent earthquakes took place, and in China they became, from this time, more and more frequent, for they recurred in 1344 in Wenzhou, where the sea overflowed in consequence, in 1345 in Qichou, and in both the following years in Canton, with subterraneous thunder. Meanwhile, floods and famine devastated various districts until 1347, when the fury of the elements subsided in China. The signs of terrestrial commotions commenced in Europe in the year 1348, after the intervening districts of country in Asia had probably been visited in the same manner. On the island of Cyprus, the plague from the east had already broken out, when an earthquake shook the foundations of the island, and was accompanied by so frightful a hurricane that the inhabitants who had slain their Mohammedan slaves, in order that they might not themselves be subjugated by them, fled in dismay in all directions. The sea overflowed, the ships were dashed to pieces on the rocks, and few outlived the terrific event, whereby this fertile and blooming island was converted into a desert. Before the earthquake, a pestiferous wind spread so poisonous an odor that many, being overpowered by it, fell down suddenly and expired in dreadful agonies. This phenomenon is one of the rarest that has been observed, for nothing is more constant than the composition of the air, and in no respect has nature been more careful in the preservation of organic life. Never have naturalists discovered in the atmosphere foreign elements which, evident to the senses and borne by the winds, spread from land to land, carrying disease over whole portions of the earth, as is recounted to have taken place in the year 1348. It is therefore the more to be regretted that in this extraordinary period, which owing to the low condition of science was very deficient in accurate observers, so little that can be depended on respecting those uncommon occurrences in the air should have been recorded. Yet German accounts say expressly that a thick, stinking mist advanced from the east and spread itself over Italy, and there could be no deception in so palpable a phenomenon. The credibility of unadorned traditions, however little they may satisfy physical research, can scarcely be called in question when we consider the connection of events. For just at this time earthquakes were more general than they had been within the range of history. In thousands of places chasms were formed, from whence arose noxious vapors. And as at that time natural occurrences were transformed into miracles, it was reported that a fiery meteor which descended on the earth far in the east had destroyed everything within a circumference of more than 100 leagues, infecting the air far and wide. The consequences of innumerable floods contributed to the same effects. Vast river districts had been converted into swamps. Foul vapors arose everywhere, increased by the odor of putrefied locusts, which had never perhaps darkened the sun in thicker swarms, and of countless corpses which, even in the well-regulated countries of Europe, they knew not how to remove quickly enough out of the sight of the living. It is probable, therefore, that the atmosphere contained foreign and sensibly perceptible admixtures to a great extent, which, at least in the lower regions, could not be decomposed and rendered ineffective by separation. Now, if we go back to the symptoms of the disease, the ardent inflammation of the lungs points out that the organs of respiration yielded to the attack of an atmospheric poison, a poison which, if we admit the independent origin of the Black Plague at any one place of the globe, which under such extraordinary circumstances it would be difficult to doubt, attacked the course of the circulation in as hostile a manner as that which produces inflammation of the spleen and other animal contagions that cause swelling and inflammation of the lymphatic glands. Pursuing the course of these grand revolutions further, we find notice of an unexampled earthquake, which on the 25th of January 1348 shook Greece, Italy, and the neighboring countries. Naples, Rome, Pisa, Bologna, Padua, Venice, and many other cities suffered considerably. Whole villages were swallowed up. Castles, houses, and churches were overthrown, and hundreds of people were buried beneath their ruins. In Carinthia, 30 villages, together with all the churches, were demolished. More than 1,000 corpses were drawn out of the rubbish. The city of Villach was so completely destroyed that very few of its inhabitants were saved. And when the earth ceased to tremble, it was found that mountains had been moved from their positions, and that many hamlets were left in ruins. It is recorded that during this earthquake the wine in the casks became turbid, a statement which may be considered as furnishing a proof that changes causing a decomposition of the atmosphere had taken place. But if we had no other information from which the excitement of conflicting powers of nature during these commotions might be inferred, yet scientific observations in modern times have shown that the relation of the atmosphere to the earth is changed by volcanic influences. Why then may we not from this fact draw retrospective inferences respecting those extraordinary phenomena? Independently of this, however, we know that during this earthquake, the duration of which is stated by some to have been a week and by others a fortnight, people experienced an unusual stupor and headache, and that many fainted away. These destructive earthquakes extended as far as the neighborhood of Basel, and recurred until the year 1360, throughout Germany, France, Silesia, Poland, England, and Denmark, and much further north. Great and extraordinary meteors appeared in many places, and were regarded with superstitious horror. A pillar of fire, which on the 20th of December 1348 remained for an hour at sunrise over the Pope's palace in Avignon, a fireball which in August of the same year was seen at sunset over Paris, and was distinguished from similar phenomena by its longer duration, not to mention other instances mixed up with wonderful prophecies and omens, are recorded in the chronicles of that age. The order of the seasons seemed to be inverted. Rains, floods, and failures in crops were so general that few places were exempt from them. And though a historian of this century assures us that there was an abundance in the granaries and storehouses, all his contemporaries with one voice contradict him. The consequences of failure in the crops were soon felt, especially in Italy and the surrounding countries, where in this year a rain which continued for 4 months had destroyed the seed. In the larger cities they were compelled in the spring of 1347 to have recourse to a distribution of bread among the poor, particularly at Florence, where they erected large bakehouses, from which in April 94,000 loaves of bread, each of 12 ounces in weight, were daily dispensed. It is plain, however, that humanity could only partially mitigate the general distress, not altogether obviate it. Diseases, the invariable consequence of famine, broke out in the country as well as in cities. Children died of hunger in their mothers' arms. Want, misery, and despair were general throughout Christendom. Such are the events that took place before the eruption of the Black Plague in Europe. Contemporaries have explained them after their own manner, and have thus, like their posterity, under similar circumstances, given a proof that mortals possessed neither senses nor intellectual powers sufficiently acute to comprehend the phenomena produced by the earth's organism, much less scientifically to understand their effects. Superstition, selfishness of 1,000 forms, the presumption of the schools laid hold of unconnected facts. They vainly thought to comprehend the whole in the individual, and perceived not the universal spirit which, in intimate union with the mighty powers of nature, animates the movements of all existence, and permits not any phenomenon to originate from isolated causes. To attempt, 5 centuries after that age of desolation, to point out the causes of a cosmical commotion, which has never recurred to an equal extent, to indicate scientifically the influences which called forth so terrific a poison in the bodies of men and animals, exceeds the limit of human understanding. If we are even now unable, with all the varied resources of an extended knowledge of nature, to define that condition of the atmosphere by which pestilences are generated, still less can we pretend to reason retrospectively from the 19th to the 14th century. But if we take a general view of the occurrences, that century will give us copious information, and as applicable to all succeeding times, of high importance. In the progress of connected natural phenomena from east to west, that great law of nature is plainly revealed, which has so often and evidently manifested itself in the earth's organism, as well as in the state of nations dependent upon it. In the inmost depths of the globe, that impulse was given in the year 1333, which, in uninterrupted succession for 26 years, shook the surface of the earth, even to the western shores of Europe. From the very beginning the air partook of the terrestrial concussion, atmospherical waters overflowed the land, or its plants and animals perished under the scorching heat. The insect tribe was wonderfully called into life, as if animated beings were destined to complete the destruction which astral and telluric powers had begun. Thus did this dreadful work of nature advance from year to year. It was a progressive infection of the zones, which exerted a powerful influence both above and beneath the surface of the earth, and after having been perceptible in slighter indications, at the commencement of the terrestrial commotions in China, convulsed the whole earth. The nature of the first plague in China is unknown. We have no certain intelligence of the disease until it entered the western countries of Asia. Here it showed itself as the oriental plague with inflammation of the lungs, in which form it probably also may have begun in China, that is to say, as a malady which spreads more than any other by contagion, a contagion that in ordinary pestilences requires immediate contact, and only under unfavorable circumstances of rare occurrence is communicated by the mere approach to the sick. The share which this cause had in the spreading of the plague over the whole earth was certainly very great, and the opinion that the Black Death might have been excluded from Western Europe by good regulations, similar to those which are now in use, would have all the support of modern experience, provided it could be proved that this plague had been actually imported from the East, or that the Oriental plague in general, whenever it appears in Europe, has its origin in Asia or Egypt. Such a proof, however, can by no means be produced so as to enforce conviction, for it would involve the impossible assumption either that there is no essential difference between the degree of civilization of the European nations in the most ancient and in modern times, or that detrimental circumstances which have yielded only to the civilization of human society and the regular cultivation of countries could not formally keep up the glandular plague. The plague was, however, known in Europe before nations were united by the bonds of commerce and social intercourse. Hence there is ground for supposing that it sprung up spontaneously, in consequence of the rude manner of living and the uncultivated state of the earth, influences which peculiarly favor the origin of severe diseases. Now we need not go back to the earlier centuries, for the 14th itself, before it had half expired, was visited by 5 to 6 pestilences. If therefore we consider the peculiar property of the plague, that in countries where it had once visited, it remains for a long time in a milder form, and that the epidemic influences of 1342, when it had appeared for the last time, were particularly favorable to its unperceived continuance till 1348, we come to the notion that in this eventful year also the germs of plague existed in southern Europe, which might be vivified by atmospherical deteriorations, and that thus, at least in part, the Black Plague may have originated in Europe itself. The corruption of the atmosphere came from the east, but the disease itself came not upon the wings of the wind, but was only excited and increased by the atmosphere where it had previously existed. This source of the Black Plague was not, however, the only one, for far more powerful than the excitement of the latent elements of the plague by atmospheric influences was the effect of the contagion communicated from one people to another on the great roads and in the harbors of the Mediterranean. From China, the route of the caravans lay to the north of the Caspian Sea, through Central Asia to Taurus. Here ships were ready to take the produce of the East to Constantinople, the capital of commerce and the medium of connection between Asia, Europe, and Africa. Other caravans went from India to Asia Minor, and touched at the cities south of the Caspian Sea, and lastly from Baghdad through Arabia to Egypt. Also the maritime communication on the Red Sea, from India to Arabia and Egypt, was not inconsiderable. In all these directions contagion made its way, and doubtless Constantinople and the harbors of Asia Minor are to be regarded as the foci of infection, whence it radiated to the most distant seaports and islands. To Constantinople the plague had been brought from the northern coast of the Black Sea, after it had depopulated the countries between these routes of commerce, and appeared as early as 1347 in Cyprus, Sicily, Marseilles, and some of the seaports of Italy. The remaining islands of the Mediterranean, particularly Sardinia, Corsica, and Majorca, were visited in succession. Foci of contagion existed also in full activity along the whole southern coast of Europe, when, in January 1348, the plague appeared in Avignon, and in other cities of the south of France and north of Italy, as well as in Spain. The precise days of its eruption in the individual towns are no longer to be ascertained, but it was not simultaneous. For in Florence the disease appeared in the beginning of April, in Cesena the 1st of June, and place after place was attacked throughout the whole year, so that the plague, after it had passed through the whole of France and Germany, where however it did not make its ravages until the following year, did not break out till August in England, where it advanced so gradually that a period of 3 months elapsed before it reached London. The northern kingdoms were attacked by it in 1349. Sweden, indeed, not until November of that year, almost 2 years after its eruption in Avignon. Poland received the plague in 1349, probably from Germany, if not from the northern countries. But in Russia it did not make its appearance until 1351, more than 3 years after it had broken out in Constantinople. Instead of advancing in a northwesterly direction from Taurus and from the Caspian Sea, it had thus made the great circuit of the Black Sea, by way of Constantinople, southern and central Europe, England, the northern kingdoms, and Poland before it reached the Russian territories, a phenomenon which has not again occurred with respect to more recent pestilences originating in Asia. Whether any difference existed between the indigenous plague excited by the influence of the atmosphere and that which was imported by contagion can no longer be ascertained from facts, for the contemporaries who in general were not competent to make accurate researches of this kind have left no data on the subject. A milder and a more malignant form certainly existed, and the former was not always derived from the latter, as is to be supposed from this circumstance that the spitting of blood, the infallible diagnostic of the latter, on the first breaking out of the plague, is not similarly mentioned in all the reports, and it is therefore probable that the milder form belonged to the native plague, the more malignant to that introduced by contagion. Contagion was, however, in itself only one of many causes which gave rise to the Black Plague. The disease was a consequence of violent commotions in the earth's organism, if any disease of cosmical origin can be so considered. One spring set 1,000 others in motion for the annihilation of living beings, transient or permanent, of mediate or immediate effect. The most powerful of all was contagion, for in the most distant countries which had scarcely yet heard the echo of the first concussion, the people fell a sacrifice to organic poison, the untimely offspring of vital energies thrown into violent commotion. We have no certain measure by which to estimate the ravages of the Black Plague, if numerical statements were wanted, as in modern times. Let us go back for a moment to the 14th century. The people were yet but little civilized. The Church had indeed subdued them, but they all suffered from the ill consequences of their original rudeness. The dominion of the law was not yet confirmed. Sovereigns had everywhere to combat powerful enemies to internal tranquillity and security. The cities were fortresses for their own defense. Marauders encamped on the roads. The husbandman was a feudal slave, without possessions of his own. Rudeness was general, humanity as yet unknown to the people. Witches and heretics were burned alive. Gentle rulers were condemned as weak. Wild passions, severity, and cruelty everywhere predominated. Human life was little regarded. Governments concerned not themselves about the numbers of their subjects, for whose welfare it was incumbent on them to provide. Thus, the first requisite for estimating the loss of human life, namely a knowledge of the amount of the population, is altogether wanting. And moreover, the traditional statements of the amount of this loss are so vague that from this source likewise there is only room for probable conjecture. Cairo lost daily, when the plague was raging with its greatest violence, from 10 to 15,000, being as many as, in modern times, great plagues have carried off during their whole course. In China, more than 13 millions are said to have died, and this is in correspondence with the certainly exaggerated accounts from the rest of Asia. India was depopulated. Tartary, the Tartar kingdom of Kapchak, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia were covered with dead bodies. The Kurds fled in vain to the mountains. In Caramania and Caesarea none were left alive. On the roads, in the camps, in the caravansaries, unburied bodies alone were seen. In a few cities only, Arabian historians named Ma'ara el-Numan, Shizur, and Harim remained in an unaccountable manner free. In Aleppo, 500 died daily. 22,000 people and most of the animals were carried off in Gaza within 6 weeks. Cyprus lost almost all of its inhabitants, and ships without crews were often seen in the Mediterranean, as afterwards in the North Sea, driving about and spreading the plague wherever they went on shore. It was reported to Pope Clement at Avignon that throughout the East, probably with the exception of China, 23,840,000 people had fallen victims to the plague. Considering the occurrences of the 14th and 15th centuries, we might on first view suspect the accuracy of these statements. How, it might be asked, could such great wars have been carried on, such powerful efforts have been made? How could the Greek Empire only 100 years later have been overthrown if the people had really been so utterly destroyed? This account is nevertheless rendered credible by the ascertained fact that the palaces of princes are less accessible to contagious diseases than the dwellings of the multitude, and that in places of importance the influx from those districts which have suffered least soon repairs even the heaviest losses. We must remember also that we do not gather much from the mere numbers without an intimate knowledge of the state of society. We will therefore confine ourselves to exhibiting some of the more credible accounts relative to European cities. In Florence there died of the Black Plague 60,000, in Venice 100,000, in Marseille in 1 month 16,000, in Sienne 70,000, in Paris 50,000, in Saint-Denis 14,000, in Avignon 60,000, in Strasbourg 16,000, in Lübeck 9,000, in Basel 14,000, in Erfurt at least 16,000, in Weimar 5,000, in Limburg 2,500, in London at least 100,000, in Norwich 51,100, to which may be added Franciscan friars in Germany 124,434, minorities in Italy 30,000. This short catalogue might, by a laborious and uncertain calculation deduced from other sources, be easily further multiplied, but would still fail to give a true picture of the depopulation which took place. Lübeck, at that time the Venice of the North, which could no longer contain the multitudes that flocked to it, was thrown into such consternation on the eruption of the plague that the citizens destroyed themselves as if in frenzy. Merchants whose earnings and possessions were unbounded coldly and willingly renounced their earthly goods. They carried their treasures to monasteries and churches and laid them at the foot of the altar. But gold had no charms for the monks, for it brought them death. They shut their gates, yet still it was cast to them over the convent walls. People would brook no impediment to the last pious work to which they were driven by despair. When the plague ceased, men thought there was still wandering among the dead, so appalling was the livid aspect of the survivors, in consequence of the anxiety they had undergone and the unavoidable infection of the air. Many other cities probably presented a similar appearance, and it is ascertained that a great number of small country towns and villages, which have been estimated, and not too highly, at 200,000, were bereft of all their inhabitants. In many places in France, not more than 2 out of 20 of the inhabitants were left alive, and the capital felt the fury of the plague alike in the palace and in the cot. 2 queens, 1 bishop, and a great number of other distinguished persons fell a sacrifice to it, and more than 500 a day died in the Hôtel Dieu under the faithful care of the Sisters of Charity, whose disinterested courage in this age of horror displayed the most beautiful traits of human virtue. For although they lost their lives, evidently from contagion, and their numbers were several times renewed, there was still no want of fresh candidates, who, strangers to the unchristian fear of death, piously devoted themselves to their holy calling. The churchyards were soon unable to contain the dead, and many houses, left without inhabitants, fell to ruins. In Avignon, the Pope found it necessary to consecrate the Rhone, that bodies might be thrown into the river without delay, as the churchyards would no longer hold them. So likewise in all populous cities, extraordinary measures were adopted in order speedily to dispose of the dead. In Vienna, where for sometimes 1,200 inhabitants died daily, the interment of corpses in the churchyards and within the churches was forthwith prohibited, and the dead were then arranged in layers by thousands in 6 large pits outside the city, as had already been done in Cairo and Paris. Yet still many were secretly buried, for at all times the people are attached to the consecrated cemeteries of their dead, and will not renounce the customary mode of interment. In many places it was rumored that plague patients were buried alive, as may sometimes happen through senseless alarm and indecent haste, and thus the horror of the distressed people was everywhere increased. In Erfurt, after the churchyards were filled, 12,000 corpses were thrown into 11 great pits, and the like might more or less exactly be stated with respect to all the larger cities. Funeral ceremonies, the last consolation of the survivors, were everywhere impracticable. In all Germany, according to a probable calculation, there seem to have died only 1,244,434 inhabitants. This country, however, was more spared than others. Italy, on the contrary, was more severely visited. It is said to have lost half its inhabitants, and this account is rendered credible from the immense losses of individual cities and provinces. For in Sardinia and Corsica, according to the account of the distinguished Florentine John Villani, who was himself carried off by the Black Plague, scarcely a third part of the population remained alive. And it is related of the Venetians that they engaged ships at a high rate to retreat to the islands, so that after the plague had carried off 3/4 of her inhabitants, that proud city was left forlorn and desolate. In Padua, after the cessation of the plague, 2/3 of the inhabitants were wanting, and in Florence it was prohibited to publish the numbers of the dead and to toll the bells at their funerals, in order that the living might not abandon themselves to despair. We have more exact accounts of England. Most of the great cities suffered incredible losses, above all Yarmouth, in which 7,052 died. Bristol, Oxford, Norwich, Leicester, York, and London, where in one burial ground alone there were interred upwards of 50,000 corpses, arranged in layers in large pits. It is said that in the whole country scarcely a 10th part remained alive, but this estimate is evidently too high. Smaller losses were sufficient to cause those convulsions whose consequences were felt for some centuries in a false impulse given to civil life, and whose indirect influence, unknown to the English, has perhaps extended even to modern times. Morals were deteriorated everywhere, and the service of God was in a great measure laid aside. For in many places the churches were deserted, being bereft of their priests. The instruction of the people was impeded. Covetousness became general, and when tranquillity was restored, the great increase of lawyers was astonishing, to whom the endless disputes regarding inheritances offered a rich harvest. The want of priests, too, throughout the country, operated very detrimentally upon the people, the lower classes being most exposed to the ravages of the plague, whilst the houses of the nobility were in proportion much more spared. And it was no compensation that whole bands of ignorant laymen, who had lost their wives during the pestilence, crowded into the monastic orders that they might participate in the respectability of the priesthood and in the rich heritages which fell into the church from all quarters. The sittings of Parliament, of the King's Bench, and of most of the other courts were suspended as long as the malady raged. The laws of peace availed not during the dominion of death. Pope Clement took advantage of this state of disorder to adjust the bloody quarrel between Edward III and Philip VI. Yet he only succeeded during the period that the plague commanded peace. Philip's death, 1350, annulled all treaties, and it is related that Edward, with other troops indeed, but with the same leaders and knights, again took the field. Ireland was much less heavily visited than England. The disease seems to have scarcely reached the mountainous districts of that kingdom, and Scotland too would perhaps have remained free had not the Scots availed themselves of the discomfiture of the English to make an irruption into their territory, which terminated in the destruction of their army by the plague and by the sword, and the extension of the pestilence through those who escaped over the whole country. At the commencement there was in England a superabundance of all the necessities of life, but the plague, which seemed then to be the sole disease, was soon accompanied by a fatal murrain among the cattle. Wandering about without herdsmen, they fell by thousands, and as has likewise been observed in Africa, the birds and beasts of prey are said not to have touched them. Of what nature this murrain may have been can no more be determined than whether it originated from communication with plague patients, or from other causes. But this much is certain, that it did not break out until after the commencement of the Black Death. In consequence of this murrain, and the impossibility of removing the corn from the fields, there was everywhere a great rise in the price of food, which to many was inexplicable because the harvest had been plentiful. By others it was attributed to the wicked designs of the laborers and dealers, but it really had its foundation in the actual deficiency arising from circumstances by which individual classes at all times endeavored to profit. For a whole year, until it terminated in August 1349, the Black Plague prevailed in these beautiful islands, and everywhere poisoned the springs of comfort and prosperity. In other countries it generally lasted only half a year, but returned frequently in individual places, on which account some, without sufficient proof, assigned to it a period of 7 years. Spain was uninterruptedly ravaged by the Black Plague till after the year 1350, to which the frequent internal feuds and the wars with the Moors not a little contributed. Alfonso XI, whose passion for war carried him too far, died of it at the siege of Gibraltar on the 26th of March 1350. He was the only king of Europe who fell a sacrifice to it, but even before this period innumerable families had been thrown into affliction. The mortality seems otherwise to have been smaller in Spain than in Italy, and about as considerable as in France. The whole period during which the Black Plague raged with destructive violence in Europe was, with the exception of Russia, from the year 1347 to 1350. The plagues which in the sequel often returned until the year 1383 we do not consider as belonging to the great mortality. They were rather common pestilences, without inflammation of the lungs, such as in former times, and in the following centuries were excited by the matter of contagion everywhere existing, and which on every favorable occasion gained ground anew, as is usually the case with this frightful disease. The concourse of large bodies of people was especially dangerous, and thus the premature celebration of the Jubilee, to which Clement VI cited the faithful to Rome, 1350, during the great epidemic, caused a new eruption of the plague, from which it is said that scarcely 1 in 100 of the pilgrims escaped. Italy was in consequence depopulated anew, and those who returned spread poison and corruption of morals in all directions. It is therefore the less apparent how that Pope, who was in general so wise and considerate, and who knew how to pursue the path of reason and humanity under the most difficult circumstances, should have been led to adopt a measure so injurious, since he himself was so convinced of the salutary effects of seclusion that during the plague in Avignon he kept up constant fires and suffered no one to approach him, and in other respects gave such orders as averted or alleviated much misery. The changes which occurred about this period in the north of Europe are sufficiently memorable to claim a few moments' attention. In Sweden, 2 princes died, Haken and Knut, half-brothers of King Magnus, and in West Gotland alone 466 priests. The inhabitants of Iceland and Greenland found in the coldness of their inhospitable climate no protection against the southern enemy who had penetrated to them from happier countries. The plague caused great havoc among them. Nature made no allowance for their constant warfare with the elements, and the parsimony with which she had meted out to them the enjoyments of life. In Denmark and Norway, however, people were so occupied with their own misery that the accustomed voyages to Greenland ceased. Towering icebergs formed at the same time on the coast of East Greenland, in consequence of the general concussion of the earth's organism, and no mortal from that time forward had ever seen that shore or its inhabitants. It has been observed above that in Russia the Black Plague did not break out until 1351, after it had already passed through the south and north of Europe. In this country also the mortality was extraordinarily great, and the same scenes of affliction and despair were exhibited as had occurred in those nations which had already passed the ordeal. The same mode of burial, the same horrible certainty of death, the same torpor and depression of spirits. The wealthy abandoned their treasures and gave their villages and estates to the churches and monasteries, this being, according to the notions of the age, the surest way of securing the favor of heaven and the forgiveness of past sins. In Russia, too, the voice of nature was silenced by fear and horror. In the hour of danger, fathers and mothers deserted their children, and children their parents. Of all the estimates of the number of lives lost in Europe, the most probable is that altogether a fourth part of the inhabitants were carried off. Now, if Europe at present contained 210 million inhabitants, the population, not to take a higher estimate, which might easily be justified, amounted to at least 105 million in the 16th century. It may therefore be assumed without exaggeration that Europe lost during the Black Death 25 million of inhabitants. That her nations could so quickly overcome such a fearful concussion in their external circumstances, and in general without retrograding more than they actually did, could so develop their energies in the following century, is a most convincing proof of the indestructibility of human society as a whole. To assume, however, that it did not suffer any essential change internally, because in appearance everything remained as before, is inconsistent with a just view of cause and effect. Many historians seem to have adopted such an opinion, accustomed as usual to judge of the moral condition of the people solely according to the vicissitudes of earthly power, the events of battles, and the influence of religion, but to pass over with indifference the great phenomena of nature, which modify not only the surface of the earth, but also the human mind. Hence, most of them have touched but superficially on the great mortality of the 14th century. We, for our part, are convinced that in the history of the world the Black Death is one of the most important events which have prepared the way for the present state of Europe. He who studies the human mind with attention and forms a deliberate judgment on the intellectual powers which set people and states in motion may perhaps find some proofs of this assertion in the following observations. At that time, the advancement of the hierarchy was in most countries extraordinary, for the Church acquired treasures and large properties in land even to a greater extent than after the Crusades. But experience has demonstrated that such a state of things is ruinous to the people, and causes them to retrograde, as was evinced on this occasion. After the cessation of the Black Plague, a greater fecundity in women was everywhere remarkable, a grand phenomenon which, from its occurrence after every destructive pestilence, proves to conviction, if any occurrence can do so, the prevalence of a higher power in the direction of general organic life. Marriages were, almost without exception, prolific, and double and treble births were more frequent than at other times. Under which head we should remember the strange remark that after the great mortality the children were said to have got fewer teeth than before, at which contemporaries were mightily shocked, and even later writers have felt surprise. If we examine the grounds for this oft-repeated assertion, we shall find that they were astonished to see children cut 20 or at most 22 teeth, under the supposition that a greater number had formerly fallen to their share. Some writers of authority, as for example the physician Savonarola at Ferrara, who probably looked for 28 teeth in children, published their opinions on the subject. Others copied from them without seeing for themselves, as often happens in other matters which are equally evident, and thus the world believed in the miracle of an imperfection in the human body which had been caused by the Black Plague. The people gradually consoled themselves after the sufferings which they had undergone. The dead were lamented and forgotten, and in the stirring vicissitudes of existence the world belonged to the living. The mental shock sustained by all nations during the prevalence of the Black Plague is without parallel and beyond description. In the eyes of the timorous, danger was the certain harbinger of death. Many fell victims to fear on the first appearance of the distemper, and the most stout-hearted lost their confidence. Thus, after reliance on the future had died away, the spiritual union which binds man to his family and his fellow creatures was gradually dissolved. The pious closed their accounts with the world. Eternity presented itself to their view. Their only remaining desire was for a participation in the consolations of religion, because to them death was disarmed of its sting. Repentance seized the transgressor, admonishing him to consecrate his remaining hours to the exercise of Christian virtues. All minds were directed to the contemplation of futurity, and children who manifest the more elevated feelings of the soul without alloy were frequently seen, while laboring under the plague, breathing out their spirit with prayer and songs of thanksgiving. An awful sense of contrition seized Christians of every communion. They resolved to forsake their vices, to make restitution for past offences before they were summoned hence, to seek reconciliation with their Maker, and to avert by self-chastisement the punishment due to their former sins. Human nature would be exalted could the countless noble actions, which in times of most imminent danger were performed in secret, be recorded for the instruction of future generations. They, however, have no influence on the course of worldly events. They are known only to silent eyewitnesses and soon fall into oblivion. But hypocrisy, illusion, and bigotry stalk abroad undaunted. They desecrate what is noble, they pervert what is divine, to the unholy purposes of selfishness, which hurries along every good feeling in the false excitement of the age. Thus it was in the years of this plague. In the 14th century, the monastic system was still in its full vigor. The power of the ecclesiastical orders and brotherhoods was revered by the people, and the hierarchy was still formidable to the temporal power. It was therefore in the natural constitution of society that bigoted zeal, which in such times makes a show of public acts of penance, should avail itself of the semblance of religion. But this took place in such a manner that unbridled, self-willed penitence degenerated into lukewarmness, renounced obedience to the hierarchy, and prepared a fearful opposition to the Church, paralyzed as it was by antiquated forms. While all countries were filled with lamentations and woe, there first arose in Hungary, and afterwards in Germany, the Brotherhood of the Flagellants, called also the Brethren of the Cross, or Cross-bearers, who took upon themselves the repentance of the people for the sins they had committed, and offered prayers and supplications for the averting of this plague. This order consisted chiefly of persons of the lower class, who were either actuated by sincere contrition, or who joyfully availed themselves of this pretext for idleness, and were hurried along with the tide of distracting frenzy. But as these brotherhoods gained in repute and were welcomed by the people with veneration and enthusiasm, many nobles and ecclesiastics ranged themselves under their standard, and their bands were not unfrequently augmented by children, honorable women, and nuns. So powerfully were minds of the most opposite temperaments enslaved by this infatuation. They marched through the cities in well-organized processions, with leaders and singers, their heads covered as far as the eyes, their look fixed on the ground, accompanied by every token of the deepest contrition and mourning. They were robed in sombre garments, with red crosses on the breast, back, and cap, and bore triple scourges tied in 3 or 4 knots, in which points of iron were fixed. Tapers and magnificent banners of velvet and cloth of gold were carried before them. Wherever they made their appearance, they were welcomed by the ringing of the bells, and the people flocked from all quarters to listen to their hymns and to witness their penance with devotion and tears. In the year 1349, 200 flagellants first entered Strasbourg, where they were received with great joy and hospitably lodged by the citizens. Above 1,000 joined the brotherhood, which now assumed the appearance of a wandering tribe and separated into 2 bodies for the purpose of journeying to the north and to the south. For more than half a year new parties arrived weekly, and on each arrival adults and children left their families to accompany them, till at length their sanctity was questioned, and the doors of houses and churches were closed against them. At Spires 200 boys of 12 years of age and under constituted themselves into a Brotherhood of the Cross, in imitation of the children who about 100 years before had united, and the instigation of some fanatic monks, for the purpose of recovering the Holy Sepulchre. All the inhabitants of this town were carried away by the illusion. They conducted the strangers to their houses with songs of thanksgiving to regale them for the night. The women embroidered banners for them, and all were anxious to augment their pomp, and at every succeeding pilgrimage their influence and reputation increased. It was not merely some individual parts of the country that fostered them. All Germany, Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, Silesia, and Flanders did homage to the mania, and they at length became as formidable to the secular as they were to the ecclesiastical power. The influence of this fanaticism was great and threatening, resembling the excitement which called all the inhabitants of Europe into the deserts of Syria and Palestine about 250 years before. The appearance in itself was not novel. As far back as the 11th century, many believers in Asia and southern Europe afflicted themselves with the punishment of flagellation. Dominicus Loricatus, a monk of Santa Croce de Villano, is mentioned as the master and model of this species of mortification of the flesh, which, according to primitive notion of the Asiatic anchorites, was deemed eminently Christian. The author of the solemn processions of the flagellants is said to have been Saint Anthony, for even in his time, 1231, this kind of penance was so much in vogue that it is recorded as an eventful circumstance in the history of the world. In 1260 the flagellants appeared in Italy as devoti. Quote, "When the land was polluted by vices and crimes, an unexampled spirit of remorse suddenly seized the minds of the Italians. The fear of Christ fell upon all, noble and ignoble, old and young, and even children of 5 years of age marched through the streets with no covering but a scarf round the waist. They each carried a scourge of leathern thongs, which they applied to their limbs, amid sighs and tears, with such violence that the blood flowed from the wounds. Not only during the day, but even by night, and in the severest winter, They traversed the cities with burning torches and banners, in thousands and tens of thousands, headed by their priests, and prostrated themselves before the altars. They proceeded in the same manner in the villages, and the woods and mountains resounded with the voices of those whose cries were raised to God. The melancholy chant of the penitent alone was heard. Enemies were reconciled. Men and women vied with each other in splendid works of charity, as if they dreaded that divine omnipotence would pronounce on them the doom of annihilation. The pilgrimages of the flagellants extended throughout all the provinces of southern Germany, as far as Saxony, Bohemia, and Poland, and even further. But at length the priests resisted this dangerous fanaticism, without being able to extirpate the illusion, which was advantageous to the hierarchy as long as it submitted to its sway. Rainier, hermit of Perugia, is recorded as a fanatic preacher of penitence with whom the extravagance originated. In the year 1296 there was a great procession of the flagellants in Strasbourg, and in 1334, 14 years before the great mortality, the sermon of Venturinus, a Dominican friar of Bergamo, induced above 10,000 persons to undertake a new pilgrimage. They scourged themselves in the churches and were entertained in the marketplaces at the public expense. At Rome, Venturinus was derided and banished by the Pope to the mountains of Ricandana. He patiently endured all, went to the Holy Land, and died in Smyrna, 1346. Hence we see that this fanaticism was a mania of the Middle Ages, which in the year 1349, on so fearful an occasion, and while still so fresh in remembrance, needed no new founder, of whom indeed all the records are silent. It probably arose in many places at the same time, for the terror of death, which pervaded all nations and suddenly set such powerful impulses in motion, might easily conjure up the fanaticism of exaggerated and overpowering repentance. The manner and proceedings of the flagellants of the 13th and 14th centuries exactly resemble each other. But if during the Black Plague simple credulity came to their aid, which seized as a consolation the grossest delusion of religious enthusiasm, yet it is evident that the leaders must have been intimately united, and have exercised the power of a secret association. Besides, the rude band was generally under the control of men of learning, some of whom at least certainly had other objects in view, independent of those which ostensibly appeared. Whoever was desirous of joining the brotherhood was bound to remain in it 34 days, and to have 4d. per day at his own disposal, so that he might not be burdensome to anyone. If married, he was obliged to have the sanction of his wife, and give the assurance that he was reconciled to all men. The Brothers of the Cross were not permitted to seek for free quarters, or even to enter a house without having been invited. They were forbidden to converse with females, and if they transgressed these rules or acted without discretion, they were obliged to confess to the superior, who sentenced them to several lashes of the scourge by way of penance. Ecclesiastics had not as such any preeminence among them. According to their original law, which however was often transgressed, they could not become masters or take part in the secret councils. Penance was performed twice every day. In the morning and evening they went abroad in pairs, singing psalms amid the ringing of the bells. And when they arrived at the place of flagellation, they stripped the upper part of their bodies and put off their shoes, keeping only a linen dress reaching from the waist to the ankles. They then lay down in a large circle in different positions according to the nature of their crime. The adulterer with his face to the ground, the perjurer on one side holding up 3 of his fingers, etc., and were then castigated, some more and some less, by the master, who ordered them to rise in the words of a prescribed form. Upon this they scourged themselves amid the singing of the psalms and loud supplications for the averting of the plague, with genuflections and other ceremonies, of which contemporary writers give various accounts, and at the same time constantly boasted of their penance, that the blood of their wounds was mingled with that of the Saviour. One of them, in conclusion, stood up to read a letter which it was pretended an angel had brought from heaven to St. Peter's Church at Jerusalem, stating that Christ, who was sore displeased at the sins of men, had granted, at the intercession of the Holy Virgin and of the angels, that all who should wander about for 34 days and scourge themselves should be partakers of the divine grace. This scene caused as great a commotion among the believers as the finding of the Holy Spear once did at Antioch. And if any among the clergy inquired who had sealed this letter, it was boldly answered, the same who had sealed the gospel. All this had so powerful an effect that the Church was in considerable danger, for the flagellants gained more credit than the priests, from whom they so entirely withdrew themselves that they even absolved each other. Besides, they everywhere took possession of the churches, and their new songs, which went from mouth to mouth, operated strongly on the minds of the people. Great enthusiasm and originally pious feelings are clearly distinguishable in these hymns, and especially in the chief psalm of the cross-bearers, which is still extant, and which was sung all over Germany in different dialects, and is probably of a more ancient date. Degeneracy, however, soon crept in. Crimes were everywhere committed, and there was no energetic man capable of directing the individual excitement to pure objects, even had an effectual resistance to the tottering Church been at that early period seasonable, and had it been possible to restrain the fanaticism. The flagellants sometimes undertook to make trial of their power of working miracles, as in Strasbourg, where they attempted in their own circle to resuscitate a dead child. They, however, failed, and their unskilfulness did them much harm, though they succeeded here and there in maintaining some confidence in their holy calling by pretending to have the power of casting out evil spirits. The Brotherhood of the Cross announced that the pilgrimage of the flagellants was to continue for a space of 34 years, and many of the masters had doubtless determined to form a lasting league against the Church, but they had gone too far. So early as the first year of their establishment, the general indignation set bounds to their intrigues, so that the strict measures adopted by the Emperor Charles IV and Pope Clement, who throughout the whole of this fearful period manifested prudence and noble-mindedness, and conducted himself in a manner every way worthy of his high station, were easily put into execution. The Sorbonne at Paris and the Emperor Charles had already applied to the Holy See for assistance against these formidable and heretical excesses, which had well nigh destroyed the influence of the clergy in every place, when 100 of the Brotherhood of the Cross arrived at Avignon from Basel and desired admission. The Pope, regardless of the intercession of several cardinals, interdicted their public penance, which he had not authorized, and on pain of excommunication prohibited throughout Christendom the continuance of these pilgrimages. Philip VI, supported by the condemnatory judgment of the Sorbonne, forbade their reception in France. Manfred, King of Sicily, at the same time threatened them with punishment by death, and in the East they were withstood by several bishops, among whom was Janusius of Gnesen and Pretzlau of Breslau, who condemned to death one of their masters, formerly a deacon, and, in conformity with the barbarity of the times, had him publicly burnt. In Westphalia, where so shortly before they had venerated the Brothers of the Cross, they now persecuted them with relentless severity, and in the Mark, as well as in all the other countries of Germany, they pursued them as if they had been the authors of every misfortune. The processions of the Brotherhood of the Cross undoubtedly promoted the spreading of the plague, and it is evident that the gloomy fanaticism which gave rise to them would infuse a new poison into the already desponding minds of the people. Still, however, all this was within the bounds of barbarous enthusiasm. But horrible were the persecutions of the Jews, which were committed in most countries with even greater exasperation than in the 12th century during the First Crusades. In every destructive pestilence, the common people at first attribute their mortality to poison. No instruction avails. The supposed testimony of their eyesight is to them a proof, and they authoritatively demand the victims of their rage. On whom then was it so likely to fall as on the Jews, the usurers, and the strangers who lived at enmity with the Christians? They were everywhere suspected of having poisoned the wells or infected the air. They alone were considered as having brought this fearful mortality upon the Christians. They were in consequence pursued with merciless cruelty, and either indiscriminately given up to the fury of the populace, or sentenced by sanguinary tribunals, which, with all the forms of law, ordered them to be burnt alive. In times like these, much is indeed said of guilt and innocence, but hatred and revenge bear down all discrimination, and the smallest probability magnifies suspicion into certainty. These bloody scenes which disgraced Europe in the 14th century are a counterpart to a similar mania of the age which was manifested in the persecution of witches and sorcerers, and like these they prove that enthusiasm associated with hatred and leagued with the baser passions may work more powerfully upon whole nations than religion and legal order, nay, that it even knows how to profit by the authority of both, in order the more surely to satiate with blood the sword of long-suppressed revenge. The persecution of the Jews commenced in September and October 1348 at Chillon on the Lake of Geneva, where the first criminal proceedings were instituted against them, after they had long before been accused by the people of poisoning the wells. Similar scenes followed in Bern and Freiburg in January 1349. Under the influence of excruciating suffering, the tortured Jews confessed themselves guilty of the crime imputed to them, and it being affirmed that poison had in fact been found in a well at Zofingen, this was deemed a sufficient proof to convince the world, and the persecution of the abhorred culprits thus appeared justifiable. Now, though we can take as little exception at these proceedings as at the multifarious confessions of witches, because the interrogatories of the fanatical and sanguinary tribunals were so complicated that by means of the rack the required answer must inevitably be obtained, and it is besides conformable to human nature that crimes which are in everybody's mouth may in the end be actually committed by some, either from wantonness, revenge, or desperate exasperation. Yet crimes and accusations are, under circumstances like these, merely the offspring of a revengeful, frenzied spirit of the people, and the accusers, according to the fundamental principles of morality, which are the same in every age, are the more guilty transgressors. Already in the autumn of 1348, a dreadful panic caused by this supposed empoisonment seized all nations. In Germany especially, the springs and wells were built over that nobody might drink of them or employ their contents for culinary purposes, and for a long time the inhabitants of numerous towns and villages used only river and rain water. The city gates were also guarded with the greatest caution. Only confidential persons were admitted, and if medicine or any other article which might be supposed to be poisonous was found in the possession of a stranger, and it was natural that some should have these things by them for their private use, they were forced to swallow a portion of it. By this trying state of privation, distrust, and suspicion, the hatred against the supposed poisoners became greatly increased, and often broke out in popular commotions, which only served still further to infuriate the wildest passions. The noble and the mean fearlessly bound themselves by an oath to extirpate the Jews by fire and sword, and to snatch them from their protectors, of whom the number was so small that throughout all Germany but few places can be mentioned where these unfortunate people were not regarded as outlaws and martyred and burnt. Solemn summonses were issued from Bern to the towns of Basel, Freiburg in the Breisgau, and Strasbourg to pursue the Jews as poisoners. The burgomasters and senators indeed opposed this requisition, but in Basel the populace obliged them to bind themselves by an oath to burn the Jews and to forbid persons of that community from entering their city for the space of 200 years. Upon this, all the Jews in Basel, whose number could not have been inconsiderate, were enclosed in a wooden building constructed for the purpose, and burnt together with it, upon the mere outcry of the people, without sentence or trial, which indeed would have availed them nothing. Soon after, the same thing took place at Freiburg. A regular diet was held in Bannefeld in Alsace, where the bishops, lords, and barons, as also deputies of the counties and towns, consulted how they should proceed with regard to the Jews. And when the deputies of Strasbourg, not indeed the bishop of this town, who proved himself a violent fanatic, spoke in favor of the persecuted, as nothing criminal was substantiated against them, a great outcry was raised, and it was vehemently asked, why, if so, they had covered their wells and removed their buckets. A sanguinary decree was resolved upon, of which the populace, who obeyed the call of the nobles and superior clergy, became but the too willing executioners. Wherever the Jews were not burnt, they were at least banished. And so, being compelled to wander about, they fell into the hands of the country people, who, without humanity and regardless of all laws, persecuted them with fire and sword. At Spires, the Jews, driven to despair, assembled in their own habitations, which they set on fire, and thus consumed themselves with their families. The few that remained were forced to submit to baptism, while the dead bodies of the murdered, which lay about in the streets, were put into empty wine casks and rolled into the Rhine, lest they should infect the air. The mob was forbidden to enter the ruins of the habitations that were burnt in the Jewish quarter, for the Senate itself caused search to be made for the treasure, which is said to have been very considerable. At Strasbourg 2,000 Jews were burnt alive in their own burial ground, where a large scaffold had been erected. A few who promised to embrace Christianity were spared, and their children taken from the pile. The youth and beauty of several females also excited some commiseration, and there was snatched from death against their will. Many, however, who forcibly made their escape from the flames, were murdered in the streets. The Senate ordered all pledges and bonds to be returned to the debtors, and divided the money among the workpeople. Many, however, refused to accept the base price of blood, and indignant at the scenes of bloodthirsty avarice which made the infuriated multitude forget that the plague was raging around them, presented it to monasteries in conformity with the advice of their confessors. In all the countries on the Rhine, these cruelties continued to be perpetrated during the succeeding months, and after quiet was in some degree restored, the people thought to render an acceptable service to God by taking the bricks of the destroyed dwellings and the tombstones of the Jews to repair churches and to erect belfries. In Mayence alone, 12,000 Jews are said to have been put to a cruel death. The flagellants entered that place in August. The Jews on this occasion fell out with the Christians and killed several. But when they saw their inability to withstand the increasing superiority of their enemies, and that nothing could save them from destruction, they consumed themselves and their families by setting fire to their dwellings. Thus also in other places the entry of the flagellants gave rise to scenes of slaughter, and as thirst for blood was everywhere combined with an unbridled spirit of proselytism, a fanatic zeal arose among the Jews to perish as martyrs to their ancient religion. And how was it possible that they could from the heart embrace Christianity when its precepts were never more outrageously violated? At Esslingen, the whole Jewish community burned themselves in their synagogue, and mothers were often seen throwing their children on the pile to prevent their being baptized, and then precipitating themselves into the flame. In short, whatever deeds fanaticism, revenge, avarice, and desperation in fearful combination could instigate mankind to perform, and wherein such a case is the limits, were executed in the year 1349 throughout Germany, Italy, and France, with impunity and in the eyes of all the world. It seemed as if the plague gave rise to scandalous acts and frantic tumults, not to mourning and grief, and the greater part of those who, by their education and rank, were called upon to raise the voice of reason, themselves led on the savage mob to murder and to plunder. Almost all the Jews who saved their lives by baptism were afterwards burnt at different times, for they continued to be accused of poisoning the water and the air. Christians also, whom philanthropy or gain had induced to offer them protection, were put on the rack and executed with them. Many Jews who had embraced Christianity repented of their apostasy, and returning to their former faith, sealed it with their death. The humanity and prudence of Clement VI must on this occasion also be mentioned to his honor. But even the highest ecclesiastical power was insufficient to restrain the unbridled fury of the people. He not only protected the Jews at Avignon as far as lay in his power, but also issued 2 bulls in which he declared them innocent, and admonished all Christians, though without success, to cease from such groundless persecutions. The Emperor Charles IV was also favorable to them, and sought to avert their destruction wherever he could. But he dared not draw the sword of justice, and even found himself obliged to yield to the selfishness of the Bohemian nobles, who were unwilling to forego so favorable an opportunity of releasing themselves from their Jewish creditors, under favor of an imperial mandate. Duke Albert of Austria burned and pillaged those of his cities which had persecuted the Jews, a vain and inhuman proceeding, which moreover is not exempt from the suspicion of covetousness. Yet he was unable in his own fortress of Kiberg to protect some hundreds of Jews who had been received there from being barbarously burnt by the inhabitants. Several other princes and counts, among whom was Ruprecht von der Pfalz, took the Jews under their protection on the payment of large sums, in consequence of which they were called Jew masters, and were in danger of being attacked by the populace and by their powerful neighbors. These persecuted and ill-used people, except indeed where humane individuals took compassion on them at their own peril, or when they could command riches to purchase protection, had no place of refuge left but the distant country of Lithuania, where Boleslav V, Duke of Poland, 1227 to 1279, had before granted them liberty of conscience. And King Casimir the Great, 1333 to 1370, yielding to the entreaties of Esther, a favored Jewess, received them and granted them further protection, on which account that country is still inhabited by a great number of Jews, who by their secluded habits have more than any people of Europe retained the manners of the Middle Ages. But to return to the fearful accusations against the Jews. It was reported in all Europe that there were in connection with secret superiors in Toledo, to whose decrees they were subject, and from whom they had received commands respecting the coining of base money, poisoning, the murder of Christian children, etc., that they received the poison by sea from remote parts, and also prepared it themselves from spiders, owls, and other venomous animals. But in order that their secret might not be discovered, that it was known only to their rabbis and rich men. Apparently, there were but few who did not consider this extravagant accusation well-founded. Indeed, in many writings of the 14th century, we find great acrimony with regard to the suspected poison mixers, which plainly demonstrates the prejudice existing against them. Unhappily, after the confessions of the first victims in Switzerland, the rack extorted similar ones in various places. Some even acknowledged having received poisonous powder in bags, and injunctions from Toledo by secret messengers. Bags of this description were also often found in wells, though it was not unfrequently discovered that the Christians themselves had thrown them in, probably to give occasion to murder and pillage, similar instances of which may be found in the persecutions of the witches. This picture needs no additions. A lively image of the Black Plague and of the moral evil which followed in its train will vividly represent itself to him who is acquainted with nature and the constitution of society. Almost the only credible accounts of the manner of living and of the ruin which occurred in private life during this pestilence are from Italy, and these may enable us to form a just estimate of the general state of families in Europe, taking into consideration what is peculiar in the manners of each country. Quote, "When the evil had become universal," speaking of Florence, "the hearts of all the inhabitants were closed to feelings of humanity. They fled from the sick and all that belonged to them, hoping by these means to save themselves. Others shut themselves up in their houses, with their wives, their children, and households, living on the most costly food, but carefully avoiding all excess. None were allowed access to them. No intelligence of death or sickness was permitted to reach their ears, and they spent their time in singing and music and other pastimes. Others, on the contrary, considered eating and drinking to excess, amusements of all descriptions, the indulgence of every gratification, and an indifference to what was passing around them as the best medicine, and acted accordingly. They wandered day and night from one tavern to another, and feasted without moderation or bounds. In this way they endeavored to avoid all contact with the sick, and abandoned their houses and property to chance, like men whose death knell had already tolled. Amid this general lamentation and woe, the influence and authority of every law, human and divine, vanished. Most of those who were in office had been carried off by the plague, or lay sick, or had lost so many members of their families that they were unable to attend to their duties, so that thenceforth every one acted as he thought proper. Others, in their mode of living, chose a middle course. They ate and drank what they pleased, and walked abroad carrying odoriferous flowers, herbs, or spices, which they smelt to from time to time, in order to invigorate the brain, and to avert the baneful influence of the air infected by the sick, and by the innumerable corpses of those who had died of the plague. Others carried their precautions still further, and thought the surest way to escape death was by flight. They therefore left the city, women as well as men, abandoning their dwellings and their relations, and retiring into the country. But of these also many were carried off, most of them alone and deserted by all the world, themselves having previously set the example. Thus it was that one citizen fled from another, a neighbor from his neighbor, a relation from his relations, and in the end so completely had terror extinguished every kindlier feeling that the brother forsook the brother, the sister, the wife, her husband, and at last even the parent his own offspring, and abandoned them unvisited and unsoothed to their fate. Those, therefore, that stood in need of assistance fell a prey to greedy attendants, who, for an exorbitant recompense, merely handed the sick their food and medicine, remained with them in their last moments, and then, not unfrequently, became themselves victims to their avarice, and lived not to enjoy their extorted gain. Propriety and decorum were extinguished among the helpless sick. Females of rank seemed to forget their natural bashfulness, and committed the care of their persons indiscriminately to men and women of the lowest order. No longer were women, relatives, or friends found in the house of mourning to share the grief of the survivors. No longer was the corpse accompanied to the grave by neighbors and a numerous train of priests carrying wax tapers and singing psalms, nor was it borne along by other citizens of equal rank. Many breathed their last without a friend to soothe their dying pillow, and few indeed were they who departed amid the lamentations and tears of their friends and kindred. Instead of sorrow and mourning, appeared indifference, frivolity, and mirth, this being considered, especially by the females, as conducive to health. Seldom was the body followed by even 10 or 12 attendants, and instead of the usual bearers and sextons, mercenaries of the lowest of the populace undertook the office for the sake of gain, and accompanied by only a few priests, and often without a single taper, it was borne to the very nearest church and lowered into the first grave that was not already too full to receive it. Among the middling classes, and especially among the poor, the misery was still greater. Poverty or negligence induced most of these to remain in their dwellings or in the immediate neighborhood, and thus they fell by thousands, and many ended their lives in the streets by day and by night. The stench of putrefying corpses was often the first indication to their neighbors that more deaths had occurred. The survivors, to preserve themselves from infection, generally had the bodies taken out of the houses and laid before the doors, where the early morn found them in heaps, exposed to the affrighted gaze of the passing stranger. It was no longer possible to have a bier for every corpse. 3 or 4 were generally laid together, husband and wife, father and mother, with 2 or 3 children, were frequently borne to the grave on the same bier, and it often happened that 2 priests would accompany a coffin, bearing the cross before it, and be joined on the way by several other funerals, so that, instead of one, there were 5 or 6 bodies for interment." Thus far Boccaccio. On the conduct of the priests, another contemporary observes, quote, "In large and small towns they had withdrawn themselves through fear, leaving the performance of the ecclesiastical duties to the few who were found courageous and faithful enough to undertake them." But we ought not on that account to throw more blame on them than on others, for we find proofs of the same timidity and heartlessness in every class. During the prevalence of the Black Plague, the charitable orders conducted themselves admirably, and did as much good as can be done by individual bodies in times of great misery and destruction, when compassion, courage, and the nobler feelings are found but in the few, while cowardice, selfishness, and ill will, with the baser passions in their train, assert the supremacy. In place of virtue, which had been driven from the earth, wickedness everywhere reared her rebellious standard, and succeeding generations were consigned to the dominion of her baleful tyranny.